Welcome to the podcast Sophie au Pays des Possibles, the third podcast in French about the women and men who combat corruption and tax evasion. I'm Sophie Lemaitre, the host of the podcast. This month's episode was recorded in English. My guest is Andrii Biletskyi, the Administrative Director of the Anti-Corruption Research and Education Center of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He's also a member of the Supervisory Board of TI Ukraine. Hi Andrii, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. As a start of this conversation, could you please tell us a bit about your background and what led you to work on anti-corruption issues?
Hi Sophie, thank you for the invitation. So my background is legal. I am a lawyer by the education. I have a PhD in law. Particularly, I wrote my PhD thesis in criminology and criminal law. And by writing my PhD thesis, actually, that's where my anti-corruption career starts. So when I was choosing my topic to write about my PhD thesis, me and my research advisor, we were wondering which topic to choose. First of all, we chose the topic which is connected to the urbanization and crime, because criminology is about crime prevention, about studying the causes and the consequences of crime. But then we decided to review our choice because anti-corruption was trendy at the time. It was 2014, 2015. And we chose to write about anti-corruption. So I wrote my thesis about how civil society in Ukraine is engaged in anti-corruption and implementing anti-corruption reforms in our country.
So what did you find out with your PhD? How does civil society engage anti-corruption in Ukraine? Back then and now, it's been 10 years. So if you've seen any changes in the way people are engaged.
Basically, everything is going to the main functions of the civil society. So they have around 5 or 6 functions, if we can say so. Of course, we're talking about monitoring and controlling of the government in different ways. It could be with open data, because Ukraine is among the countries which has a lot of open data before the war. Now we have some closed register, but still we have a lot of open data with which civil society can monitor and control what is going on in the government. Of course, there are possible ways for civil society to engage with the government authorities by cooperating with them. For instance, our anti-corruption authorities in Ukraine, they have so-called civic control councils, where the civil society can represent themselves and to control, to speak with this particular anti-corruption authority. I am also a member of the Civic Control Council of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention. And when there are some public scandals or some issue we need to be resolved or revised, we are largely engaged in this particular matter. Of course, we are talking about the function of exposing of corruption. So civil society, with the help of open data, other sources, they can expose corruption within the government, within the national police, within the prosecutors, within the local authorities, and etc., etc. So there are a lot of possible ways on how they can expose corruption in Ukraine. Also, we are talking about advocacy and communication functions. So civil society in Ukraine, they are largely involved in the advocacy of anti-corruption reforms. Not only writing legislation, writing recommendations for the government and proposing these recommendations, but also to promote this legislation among the members of parliament or to the president or to the cabinet of the ministers. So this is one of the greater things, I think, why civil society in Ukraine is so powerful, because of the advocacy function and because the advocacy capacities of civil society in Ukraine are really, really great. Communication, of course, we are talking about spreading the word about corruption, about anti-corruption, about the successes and challenges which are in Ukraine. I can say that these main functions, they are still in place till now. Of course, we are talking about changing of the context because, again, there was a COVID when everything was closed and it was really hard to cooperate with the government because of the COVID restrictions. But again, as the world changes, we also changed and we could establish cooperation via online, which was also a good thing. It was hard from the beginning because, for instance, there are committees in Ukrainian parliament, and one of the committees is anti-corruption committee. And before COVID, we could go there and participate in the committee. So to listen what they are saying, what they are reviewing, which legislation they are passing, and etc., etc. But with the COVID, it was a little bit harder because no one was allowed to go outside to visit the committee. The committee was online and it was broadcasted via YouTube, but it was hard for the YouTube viewer to really participate. So you can write comment, but it could be ignored easily. So it was one of the challenges. Of course, with the war, it also became a little bit challenging for Ukrainian civil society to influence the anti-corruption policy, anti-corruption reforms, because first of all, after the war started, the government closed a lot of open data registers because of the security measures. But after some time, they opened not all of them, but I would say 70 or 80% back. And civil society could monitor and control again the government spendings, what the government is doing, especially in the security and national defense sector, which is also quite relevant for the country within the war, because you can see right now there are some talks, and recently there was exposing committed by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. They exposed member of parliament and the heads of the regional administration on the corruption within public procurement of the drones which are used on the battlefield.
You mentioned earlier, I hope I'm not mistaken, but the Integrity Council where civil society can be on. It's interesting. Can you tell us more about it? Because that's something, for example, we do not have in France, and would be great to hear about how it functions and whether anti-corruption authorities are bound by what the council say. How does it work exactly? And who can be part of this council?
The answer for this question is you need to divide it. So there are different ways on how civil society can be involved with cooperation and controlling of the anti-corruption authority. So the first one is civic control councils. So these are the civil society and civic, let's say, departments, organs or authorities or bodies which are established within the anti-corruption authority. So for instance, we have National Agency on Corruption Prevention, which is the main body to formulate and implement anti-corruption policy in Ukraine. So within this body, there is a Civic Control Council, which is established. And the thing is that the national agency, they are not just picking whoever they want from the civil society, like pointing the finger and saying, this one, we like to join him, the civic control body, the other one we don't like. But there are elections, open elections. So we have one working day from 9 to 6, I think. And people can vote with their mobile phones for the particular candidacy. There are 15 members within this civic body, and they are established with the main goal to provide civil society control over the activities of the particular body. So for instance, there is an issue when there is a man or woman who are applying for the national agency to control and asking them to control the finances of some particular official. But national agency didn't reply, or I don't know, say that we don't want to do that. And this particular people, they are asking the civic control body to help them to control the activity, to ask NACP why they didn't want to control it, to check the financial situation of the particular official. This is how it works. Also, the members of the civic control bodies, they are members of the disciplinary commissions within this authority, and they are members of the selection commissions of this authority. So when the new people are hired, they are hired through the selection procedure. Civil society also take part in this particular process. So they are members and they participate in the selection. They can ask questions, they can control whether everything is transparent, and really, really good people are hired. The second part of my answer is what you called integrity councils. So as you know, I recently published a study on the integrity councils. So this is another kind of thing, because when the revolution of dignity happened in Ukraine in 2014, one of the main reasons was that Ukraine needed to address corruption. And we need to establish new anti-corruption authorities. But how can we establish them and be sure that they will not be as corrupt as the previous law enforcement or previous judiciary? So then the reformers, together with the government, they came up with the idea that we need to secure the selection process of the heads of these anti-corruption bodies by creating special councils to select them. So there are different ways. In the beginning, they were like mostly composed of civil society, but now the situation evolved and they evolutionized. Now we have almost everywhere in every selection committee, we have like 6 people, 3 of which are nominated by the international authorities, international organizations, for instance, US, European Union, OECD, or etc., etc. And these people who are nominated by the international authorities, they have a veto. Their saying is vital. So, for instance, if you have a tie between international members and national members, it is more important what international members say rather than national, because the history of this integrity council showed us that sometimes national members could be politicized, they could be controlled by the government, and that is why it is really important to preserve this right from international members of the committee.
Great and very complete, exhaustive answer. On the civic control body, do we find them linked to every authorities in Ukraine, or is it only a couple related to anti-corruption?
No, actually, you can find it almost in every authority in the country. So, for instance, we have Kharkiv local administration, and there is a civic council within this Kharkiv local administration. You have the Ministry of Interior. There is also a civic control body. So almost everywhere except judiciary, of course. So within the courts, there is no civic control councils. And if I'm not mistaken, the specialized anti-corruption prosecutor office, they also don't have such kind of body. But yeah, almost everywhere.
That's very interesting, the way civil society is included and can participate in public life. That's very innovative compared to France, for example, where we have very, very limited bodies or instances where citizens or civil society can be integrated as in the public life and have a say the way you are explaining it. Earlier, you mentioned that several officials were arrested. That was early August in relation to a corruption case for the purchase of drones. And that wasn't the first corruption investigation in the defense sector. So I'd be interesting to hear from you. What are the main corruption challenges in Ukraine right now?
Of course, we could say that the main corruption risks for Ukraine right now lies within several sectors, which are really crucial for Ukraine at the moment. Of course, it's the defense sector and national security sector, it's reconstruction sector, it's energy sector, and everything there. The main corruption risk there are connected with the public procurement and with the purchases. Because we see that, for instance, in the national defense sector, Ukraine needs right now the ammunition, they need other stuff for the army, and we need to buy it somewhere from someone. It is really important that the money that we have, limited money, because the economy of Ukraine is mostly funded by the partners and partially funded by Ukraine itself, but these are limited money, and it is really important to ensure that this money will be well spent. Unfortunately, we had some corruption cases where the officials of the Ministry of Defense, they were abusing their position and using their position to make money on the purchases for the army. I mentioned already drones. There was a corruption case connected to the jackets for the army. So the Ministry of Defense were buying jackets from the Turkish company, which was actually connected to the other Ukrainian citizens, and they were purchasing it for the higher price. There was also a corruption case for the food for the army, also with the much higher prices for the food than you can find in, for instance, in the local store. And with the drones, I've already mentioned. So for the reconstruction, also, unfortunately, a hugely important area for us. And again, we know that already we are receiving the money for the reconstruction in several cities, and you can imagine how much money will be coming after the war stopped and after the war ended. Yeah, we have unfortunately also cases on this. We have members of parliament who are charged with active bribery for proposing a bribe for the. There was an ex-head of the agency of reconstruction in Ukraine, and member of parliament tried to bribe him in order to get the reconstruction project for him or for his affiliated firms or people. With the energy sector, also important thing for Ukraine because Russians are targeting Ukrainian energy sector, power plants, and etc., and they need to be reconstructed, to be rebuilt, and etc. This is also a field where corruptioners they could use it because they are again there are purchases of the technologies for the power plants, and they can buy old stuff for a big money, or they can buy, for instance, little amount of technologies again for a huge amount of money, and they can make money on that.
Would you say with war corruption opportunities increased or it more or less stayed the same as before the war?
It's hard to say, but I would say that they are not increased, but more opportunities came from the sectors which before the war they were not really in place. So again, there was no reconstruction before the war started. Yeah, no one actually talked about. There were talks, I think, but not really those talks as we have right now. And with the Ministry of Defense, of course, there was corruption before the war, but I think not a lot of opportunities to make money like now.
With the example you gave us, we started to see that corruption is far from a victimless crime. I mean, you gave the example of the food, and maybe that impacts the soldiers fighting. Maybe they don't have access to proper food. So we see corruption has dire consequences, especially in wartime. Could you tell us more about the impacts for people's life and how people in Ukraine react to all the corruption scandals that we see?
It's a very complicated topic, to be honest, on how corruption affects people's lives and what they do about it. I've already mentioned the corruption scheme in the Ministry of Defense for the food and for the jackets. So obviously the soldiers, they not receive proper food, so they receive bad food. Actually, I could say that it demotivates them. Of course, with the drones, with the other ammunition, bad ammunition, which was bought with the corruption schemes, it affects the ability of Ukraine to defend itself. If we are talking about the civic life, the reconstruction, for instance, the reconstruction of a school, like we have a particular school where the reconstruction was in place and it was reconstructed in a corrupt way. So there were more money spent and less work done. Of course, the quality of the reconstruction is in question. School children, their parents, they are affected about it. Corruption in Ukraine and narrative about corruption, of course, it affects a lot of people. And right now, when we have the situation of war and when people, of course, people who can flee the country, some people asking themselves whether I want to live in such country, whether I want to flee the country to the Western countries. And people who are right now in European Union, for instance, in Germany, in Czech Republic, in other countries, some people may ask themselves whether I want to return to the country where the corruption is in place. This is really a bad thing for Ukraine. But on a positive note, I think that corruption narrative about Ukraine is somehow overhyped. Regarding the reaction, we've already seen the protests which took place in July. They were because of the legislation passed, which actually undermined the procedural rights of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and actually put them under prosecutors general. So about the anti-corruption authorities, the main principle of their activities, they should be independent from anyone, from president, from the parliament, from executive bodies, from the prosecutors general, and etc. But the government of Ukraine decided, they formulated it like, we need to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of these bodies and to eliminate Russian influence within these bodies. But we didn't have enough evidences, both inefficiency and ineffectiveness, and of course about the Russian influence within these bodies. And people, after several bad moves by the government, they had enough and they came to the protests against this legislation. What was interesting about this protest, mostly there were young people from 18 till 24 or 25 years. They came to the protests. Previously, there is a think tank and a journalistic organization in Ukraine called Texty, as they published a study that showed that the disinformation campaign against NABU and SAPO started like from the beginning of June. And they tried to spread the narrative that anti-corruption authorities in Ukraine are ineffective and we need to eliminate them, get rid of them, and to, put them under prosecutors general. And these narratives and the money spent on this disinformational campaign, they didn't work because young people, they were not reading these particular Telegram channels or they were not reading this particular news. They were reading some other leaders of thoughts, like the bloggers and etc., etc. And they came to the protest to defend the European movement and Euro integration process of Ukraine mostly, not to defend particular NABU or SAPO, like the personalities within these authorities, because we can agree that they are not ideal, they have their flaws, they made their mistakes, but they are one of the big reforms that Ukraine succeeded after 2014. And European Union, other Western partners, they are saying this and they are saying that you need to keep anti-corruption authorities in place. So this was one of the reactions of how people actually react to the corruption in Ukraine.
And what was the result of these demonstrations? I mean, they were quite huge and it was quite important because, again, we are in times of war, so it's rare to have demonstration against government or, being and protesting in the streets when there is war. So what was the result of this protest and where are we now with this reform?
Yeah, and I must say that these were the first anti-government protests in Ukraine after the war started. So before that, no anti-government protest. So the result, what we have now, the president prepared a bill and it was approved by the parliament at the end of July. And it almost reversed the situation that we had before this bad legislation was passed on the 22nd of July. So they reversed the situation with the independence of the NABU and SAPO. But what they kept is that Security Service of Ukraine now has 6 months to check not only NABU and SAPO but also other authorities to check whether they have the personnel connected with the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, this leaves some flaws and some risks because even if you have the family in Russia with whom you are not speaking at the moment or you haven't spoke to them for quite a long time, this could be used as an excuse to fire you from the anti-corruption authority or to fire you from the important corruption case, for instance. What we also have, all the law enforcement and anti-corruption authorities, they have to do, again, the checks on the polygraph twice a year by the methodology established by the Security Service of Ukraine, again, to check with the affiliation with the aggression country. But unfortunately, we have some risks within this saying it could be easily used or misused or abused. We get the independence of NABU and SAPO back. This is a positive note. But the negative note is that we have this security risk which could be used against good people in these anti-corruption bodies.
That means people need to be vigilant and monitor what will be happening in the next couple of months. But like you said, it's a positive note seeing people protesting and defending the independence of the anti-corruption agency and the special prosecutor office for corruption. So it's really important to have the support of citizens. There is a question I wanted to ask. We see that Russia, but also Hungary and other countries, they use the corruption narrative or the corruption scandals against Ukraine. So my question is, how can we talk about corruption without it being used against the country, without, undermining Ukraine's efforts?
The easy answer for this question is to shift the narrative. Now the narrative is that you see how many corruption cases are in Ukraine. Ukraine is hugely corrupt. We have exposings every day of corruption in Ukraine. But the problem which should be addressed is that there is not so much corruption as we are exposing them and why we are exposing it. So we have mechanisms in place which can let us to expose corruption. I've already mentioned not once that we have open data registers. For instance, the Prozoro, the public procurement digital system, when everybody can see everything. This is their slogan. We have beneficiary registers. We have registers of the companies, of the private entities. We have the registers for the property rights. We have the e-declaration system, again, where everyone can see everything and they can track whether people or some officials have illegal cash or illegal money. This is the question of the illicit enrichment, for instance, or for the civic forfeiture of their assets, which were obtained in a corrupt way. We also have anti-corruption system in place, which, as we can see, successfully exposing corruption within the government. So the easy answer is that we build such a system where corruption can be seen. Of course, we can say it is better to live in the ignorance, because ignorance is bliss. And without knowing about corruption, it's an easy life. So you can live your life, don't know about corruption in your country, pay the taxes, and don't know that your taxes are being used for the corrupt reconstruction, corrupt purchases for the army, corrupt purchases for the kindergarten of your children, and etc., etc. Of course, it's much, much easier to live this way, but unfortunately or not, Ukraine chose another path starting from the 2014. We want to eliminate corruption, we want to get rid of it, and we want to address it. And of course, we see ourselves as a part of the European Union and the Western democratic world, and that is why we brought that system in our country. Of course, this false narrative that Ukraine is hugely corrupt doesn't make any sense because we see corruption cases in every country. Of course, in the European Union, there is no exception. Hungary is also could be seen as a corrupt country. We also saw in recent examples in France, in I think Lithuania, with the corruption cases. In Lithuania, there was a minister who was charged with corruption because he gave the credits to his affiliated firm from the government, and I think he resigned recently. So corruption is everywhere, so you cannot get rid of corruption. Ukraine is not a unique country where the corruption is like, wow, on a huge, huge levels. No. But again, because of the mechanisms in place, we can talk about corruption in our everyday life, and we can see corruption in everyday life.
Oh, definitely in France, not an example. I think almost every week, if you work on anti-corruption, I think every week you see a corruption case at the local, regional, or national level. So, and that's the question whether it means France is a corrupt country or whether our institutions and civil society is just that we are better at detecting corrupt practices and we changed approach to corruption. So that's always the question. But the thing is, addressing corruption is not the same thing when you are in time of peace or when you are in times of war. So how can we address corruption when we are in this wartime? What can we do? And how can civil society help keep anti-corruption high on the agenda while there may be other priorities?
A really complicated question, to be honest.
Sorry, I only have complicated questions. I mean,
Yeah,
anti-corruption is a
no problem.
complicated topic, so there is no easy answer.
I'll tell you the Ukrainian experience of how we did this. So, in the beginning of full-scale invasion, it was the memorandum between the government and civil society that, first of all, we need to stop the invaders, and then we can talk about our internal problems. This memorandum, of course, unwritten memorandum, it was in place for the first couple of months, for 2 or 3 months, I think. But then civil society saw the flaws of this memorandum. They saw the flaws within the government when they started to make money on the purchases, some other corruption cases. It was again because of the closed data. So all the register I've mentioned, like e-declaration system, the register of the beneficiaries, the property rights register, they were all closed because of the national security reasons. Because of that, civil society capacities were not really great and they could not expose corruption as successfully as they did before the war. One of the first things that we were advocating was to open the registers, which are not that crucial or could not be used by the Russians. Of course, there are some security limitations. For instance, the servants of the security service, they are not obliged to file the e-declaration, or the government officials from the occupied territories, they are not obliged to file e-declaration. So this was how this thing started. But what can you do? Of course, I hope it won't happen, but if you have war in your country, and how to keep the anti-corruption on the agenda. Of course, first of the things that you need is to ensure that the anti-corruption system is in place and still operating. Because it could be that your government will say, okay, we don't need anti-corruption right now, we will get rid of these authorities, and then maybe we will restore them. This is not the case. Of course, you need to establish the control mechanisms of the public procurement in your country over the defense procurement. Of course, having in mind the national security risks, you need to establish control over the reconstruction process. You need to establish control on the purchases in other sectors, health sector, energy sector, etc. But right now we see that the will of the anti-corruption authorities in Ukraine to continue the war, because they know that while soldiers and the army, they are defending ourselves from the external invaders, we need to keep the internal problems in place and to address them, not to keep them and say, okay, this is not important for now. Because if you fail within your country, within your government, you will fail on the battlefield. If you don't have strong institutions in your country that can help other institutions and the army, of course you will fail, and it would be an easy win for your rivals.
Yeah, there are many things at stake. You mentioned several initiatives that help to tackle corruption with the different registers, but that there's one thing we didn't discuss in terms of our progress or how we can address corruption is education. That's part of your role with the Anti-Corruption Research and Education Center. Can you tell us how education and training can help tackle corruption, and what you are doing and why it is important to train on corruption and anti-corruption?
You can see right now that the anti-corruption sector in Ukraine is quite big, quite large. We have a lot of institutions. We had a big part of civil society who are involved in this particular sector. And of course, we need personnel, trained personnel who can work on anti-corruption reforms, on the investigations, on the corruption risk analysis. They are not, producing themselves somewhere in the country and then come to the anti-corruption sector. We need special initiatives for this. So my center, we established a master program on anti-corruption studies, where we give a broad concept of corruption for them. So we are not teaching them only legal concepts. We are teaching political science, we are teaching sociology, economics, behavioral economics, other stuff which is connected to corruption, because we want them to have a broad view on corruption, because you cannot eradicate or eliminate corruption simply by producing more legislation or simply changing the behavior. So it's a complex issue and we need to address it in a complex way too. So that is how and why we established this master program. We also had a certificate program for the compliance officers who are working within the government to help them to identify corruption risks in the infrastructure process. So we worked with the Ministry of Infrastructure in Ukraine, and we taught about 45 compliance officers from different regions in Ukraine to address corruption risk within the infrastructure. So we showed them where corruption risk could arise. We used different example and country cases of Balkan countries, of Afghanistan, where the reconstruction happened, and we showed them the cases of the particular corruption risk. We showed them the corruption risk in the public procurement, and we showed them how they could establish the anti-corruption work within their particular authority. We talk a lot about anti-corruption and about implementing the reforms, but sometimes, unfortunately, people forget to ask who will be implementing these reforms. For instance, now we had a selection of the Public Integrity Council, which is a civic control council which helps to vet the judges within the judiciary. Now we saw a problem that we don't have enough people, enough good analytics to do that. And by supporting the anti-corruption education sector, we can produce more people to help this particular example. But again, unfortunately, the international organization and international donors, they are not supporting enough of this particular sector. So anti-corruption education is crucial and important, as we don't have a lot of anti-corruption education opportunities in our country. And the more people we will prepare, the better anti-corruption sector will be, and maybe it will help to minimize the corruption risks in everyday life.
Great. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I think that gives us really a great overview of what's happening on the anti-corruption front in Ukraine. And I think your words about education are really important. We need to train people, create a culture of integrity and anti-corruption. So thanks again for being with us on the podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode. Share it with your network, friends, family, and colleagues to help spread the word. You can listen to my other episodes recorded in English. Episode 19 is about the Corruption Hunter Network. Check out my episode with Niels Kurbis on corruption and artificial intelligence, my episode with Pusetso Morapedi on the creation of an international anti-corruption court, and the one with Daniela Cepeda Cuadrado on corruption and health. If you understand or speak French, take a look at the 45 plus episodes available. And if you can leave me a 5-star recommendation, that would be fantastic. Thanks again for listening to this episode.